Good evening. We'll start with our prayer. Om Sahana Bhavatu Sahanau Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitam astu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May we be protected together. May we be nourished together. May we grow strong together. May our learning shine forth in our lives. May we not find fault with one another. Om, peace, peace, peace. So we begin our study of tonight with this prayer, ancient prayer of the Upanishads, that we engage in this together, and we pray that this, what we study, may bring us, may protect us, may bring us strength, and that we may manifest it in our lives. We may put it into our lives, that it becomes something practical, that it's not mere book learning, but actually shines in our lives, it manifests in our lives. And while studying, we may have some disagreements, we may have some questions, we may discuss some things, but which shouldn't make us find fault with one another and criticize one another. We will, if we have questions and disagreements, we'll discuss those and find out what the scripture says to us. And so I also begin by offering my pranams to Swami Sumanasananji, who, as usual, is embarrassing me by attending my class. And I thank you for joining, so that there's someone to talk to. There are some people joining online also, but with people in person, it helps a lot. Can you hear me more or less? You're putting this up close. Should I put this here?
Anywhere.
Does it help?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So, we are reading the records of the classes of Karma Yoga, which Swami Vivekananda gave in December of 1895 in New York City. He had just come back from England. He had spent quite some time in England, and both in I think it was Caversham, wasn't it? And then in London itself. Then he came back, and he landed in New York on the 6th of December, and immediately started teaching. He had rooms at, what's the address? West 39th Street, 228 West 39th Street in New York. No, this is in New York City. 39th Street, which was not perhaps the greatest part of town, but people came anyway, and they flocked to these classes. Now, on December 12th, an advertisement had been placed in the paper that the Vedanta Society was seeking a stenographer to take down the classes. And the advertisement only appeared once, that one day, December 12th. And so we presume that Goodwin, J.J. Goodwin, answered that advertisement and showed up immediately, because by December 13, this first class in Karma Yoga was delivered, and it's thoroughly taken down, which means Goodwin must have been present, the very gifted and skilled stenographer. So Goodwin was in the room, and dozens of other men and women of coming from different backgrounds and different classes of people, crowded into those two rooms, hanging on to Swamiji's every word. Friday, December 13, 1895, this was his first class in the morning. The advanced classes were given in the morning and the beginners in the evening. So this was the first class for advanced students on Karma Yoga, called Each is Great in His Own Place, in his or own place. New York was chilly. 13 degrees Fahrenheit was the low, 24 degrees Fahrenheit the high that day. And I just looked in the news of the day was that there was a new gun had been invented, the Maxim rapid fire gun. In other words, one of the first machine guns. So there was war and weaponry being discussed, and also there was an article on looking for election fraud. So if we think that what's going on in the news today and all the hubbub about election fraud and all this, if we think that's something new, forget it. Look 100 years ago, or in this case, 127 years ago, and you find the same story, the same news going on. So that was kind of an eye-opener. We think, oh my gosh, election fraud. They're worrying about it every election. It's going back into history. So we shouldn't get too much bent out of shape over all these things. Okay, so in this class, the title pretty much says it all. We are called in Karma Yoga to shine in our own calling, to find what our calling is in life and to do our best in that calling. And that calling, how do we find that calling? It has to do with our own samskars, our own tendencies, our own gifts, perhaps also to a certain extent in the family in which we are born and the society in which we are born. Some are called to be carpenters. Some are called to be lawyers. Some are called to be monks. And even if you're called to be a monk, some are called to be to do one kind of thing as a monk or another kind of thing as a monk. So Karma Yoga is about following our calling as best we can and making that as an offering unto the divine. Rather than, and of course there's still also a great danger, if our calling is to be a carpenter and we think we ought to be a lawyer, we'll be miserable. And we won't, we may be able to do the work of a lawyer better than we can do the work of a carpenter. And yet if it's not our calling, we're going to be miserable. So we talked in our previous classes also about this idea of, it's oftentimes, when we find our calling, it's not, if we feel like we haven't found our calling, perhaps it's because we're not doing that thing with the right attitude. That actually, and we had the example from Peace Pilgrim of the architect, whose calling clearly was to be an architect. And yet, this architect was doing his work for all the wrong reasons. He was trying to make lots of money and get famous and keep ahead of the Joneses, as we say. And Peace Pilgrim talked to him about trying to do his work as service. And she met him 2 years later, and he was still an architect, but this time he had found peace of mind. Why? Because he was doing his work as service for others. His main aim was to serve. And in the meantime, his business was doing very well. People loved his architecture because he was doing it as service. So this example, of course, is from the Gita. Arjuna thinks that his calling is to be a monk when he sees the army arrayed and he knows he has to go kill people. So Sri Krishna tells him, do your own dharma, your swadharma, what you are called to do that. That is what you have to do. Doing someone else's dharma will only lead to ruin. So it's, of course, a great challenge for many people to actually understand what is my calling. Many people seek for that and struggle to find it, and maybe do something that they never feel satisfied with it. And other people, there was a little video I saw yesterday, someone asking people, oh, how do you make a living? And then asking them, do you like it? And then they would say, oh yes, what do you do for a living? Oh, I'm a cook, I'm a chef. Oh, do you like it? Yes. And he found a guy delivering packages for UPS, which doesn't sound like a very fulfilling kind of a job. But he asked him, do you like it? He smiled and he said, yes, I like it. So that person was apparently, that was his calling, to serve people by bringing them the things they need.
Swamiji said refers to
228 West 39th Street, yes. Yes. Which is likely where he was living in the same house with prostitutes, but wouldn't think of saying a word of condemnation. Why? Because he was becoming established in that love which makes no difference, sees everyone as an embodiment of the divine. So the first part of this class, he discussed this idea of finding our calling and following it and doing it perfectly. And then he starts reading from the Mahanirvana Tantra, which discusses in one of the chapters, it goes in depth into the duties of a householder. And so we're in the middle of those verses, which he is translating more or less literally in most places from the Sanskrit and discussing them. And he had just discussed how there are certain things that the householder should not talk about. This is about guarding one's speech, which also is a part of karma yoga. Speech also is work, is karma. So he's quoting the 3 things a householder must not talk about. He or she must not talk in public of his or her own fame. We know some people who they like to tell you all the great things they did, right? And they especially in their old age, maybe. Oh, and we had so many people. There were articles in the paper about me and all those things, and of course it's painful to hear someone talk like that. So this is pointing out we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't talk about our own fame and success. We should not preach our own name or our own powers. We must not talk of our wealth or of anything that has been told to us privately. Okay? If someone tells us something and says, look, please don't share this with others, we shouldn't share it with others. In fact, that's one of the sure ways to make sure everybody finds out about something. Listen, I need to tell you something, but don't tell anybody. Most likely that news will travel very quickly. All right. And then, this is interesting. If he or she has committed some mistake or has engaged in a work where he or she is sure to fail, he or she must not talk of these things or make them public. So neither should we trumpet our successes, nor should we publicize our failures. It's very interesting. Because we are, as karma yogis, we are not after the fruits of our labors. So if we fail, if we make a mistake, that also we shouldn't discuss. In fact, it's one of our vows, in our monastic vows, brahmacharya vows, that we should not think of our own past misdeeds, our own mistakes. That will bring us down. If we think of the things we did in the past, we've all made mistakes, and we can go on ruminating over those. Oh, I did this bad thing. Gosh, I feel so bad. How are we going to attain purity of mind? How are we going to focus our mind on God? Our purpose is to know the divine, to realize God, and that requires purity of mind. And karma yoga is one of the tools we use to attain that purity of mind, by doing work and offering it. And where we find difficulties, we know that there we have some impurities in our mind. Where we rub up against others, there we know we have to let things go. We have to work on these things. So if we make mistakes, but if we go on ruminating over them, it harms us. It pulls us down. Yes, take the lesson. If we have made a mistake, all right, take a lesson. I've learned let me not do that again. But not go on ruminating over it. Let it go, let it go. In fact, that's my topic on Sunday, the fine art of forgetting. We also have to learn how to forget certain things. We have to keep remembering God and forget our mistakes, forget the insults that people spoke to us, those kind of things. All right. Next section here, Swami Vivekananda reminds us, the householder is the basis, the prop of the whole of society. He or she is the principal earner. Then he goes on, this is from the scripture. And then he goes on to explain all the poor, the weak, the children, the women who at that time do not earn a living, live upon the householder. So there must be certain duties he or she must perform, and these duties must make him or her strong to perform this work, and not make the householder feel that the work is beneath his ideal, beneath her ideal. Therefore, if one has done something weak or has committed some mistakes, one must not say so in public. And if one is engaged in some enterprise and knows one is sure to fail in it, one should not speak it out. At the same time, one must struggle hard to acquire these things. First, knowledge, and second, wealth. It is the householder's duty, and if one does not, one is nobody. All right, he points out clearly, actually, it stands to reason. The householder, the person who earns wealth is the main support of society. Because what supports society? Well, wealth supports society, money supports society. We, all of us who earn a living, also have to pay taxes. And now it's sort of codified in governmental, and some people think it's a terrible thing. But who's going to pick up the garbage if there's no taxes to pay for the garbage pickup? And who's going to pave the streets if there's nobody to? Those funds have to come from somewhere. That wealth has to come from somewhere. So this idea of being part of society, actually being the pillar of society. The householder is the pillar of society. Everybody else depends on the householder. The children, the elderly, those who cannot work, and the monks also depend on the householder. So society pays homage to the householder, who actually is the support of all. We all have our part to play in that society, and the monks and the children and the elderly and those who cannot work, they also play their integral part in society. But no doubt the householder who generates wealth plays a very important part. And yet, we will see just a little later what is the purpose of that wealth. So on the one hand, the householder's duty is to earn wealth. And on the other hand, we'll see, it is the householder's duty, and if one does not do so, one is nobody. A householder who does not struggle to get wealth is immoral. Sometimes we think, oh, money is the root of all evil. Well, here, Swamiji is saying the householder who does not struggle to earn wealth is immoral. If one is lazy and content to lead a lazy life, one is immoral, because upon the householder depend hundreds. If the householder gets riches, hundreds of others will be supported. He points out, if there were not in this city hundreds who had striven to become rich and who had acquired wealth, where would all these things be? Where would all this civilization and almshouses and great houses be if they had not struggled? So, going after money in the householder's case is not bad. But that money must be for distribution. There he puts it. So what's the purpose of generating wealth? Not, yes, to support my family, to support myself, but not to build million-dollar palaces and multi-million-dollar mansions and all of that. No, for distribution, recognizing that the householder is the pillar of society. The householder is the center. It is a worship for the householder to acquire money. For the householder who struggles to get money by good means is doing the same thing as the anchorite in his cell when he is praying. And then he gives a Latin quote, laborare est orare. This is a Latin quote which means to labor is to pray. This is apparently from the rule of Saint Benedict, which was a very old rule for Christian monks. Benedictine monasteries today still follow the rule of Saint Benedict, and it's a remarkable document. There's a lot of practical wisdom in it and a lot of monastic traditions embedded in this rule of Saint Benedict. And the monks in Benedictine monasteries work. They do physical work, physical labor. In addition to praying 5 times a day in the church, they also do physical labor in the fields, and this was how the monasteries were supported. And also, it was a recognition that yes, monks also have to work, and that work should not be different from prayer. It's a spiritual practice. So Benedict was also a karma yogi. He also taught karma yoga. And was Swamiji familiar with this? This was also taken as a motto by the Freemasons. And Swamiji had been inducted into the Freemasons. He had joined the Freemasons as a young man before he became a monk. And so far as we know, he never quit or was expelled from the Freemasons, though he didn't obviously participate in their activities after becoming a monk. But so probably he became familiar with this term, laborare est orare. To labor is to pray. All right, I think perhaps we should try to move a little through because we want to finish this class today. A lot of quotes here from the Mahanirvana Tantra on the duties of the householder. The householder must struggle to acquire a good name by all means, and must give up these things. One must not gamble, one must not move in the companionship of the wicked, one must not tell lies, and must not be the cause of trouble to others. You know, just as a slight digression, there is a fascinating discussion with Sri Ramakrishna and his disciples. This issue of earning money came up several times, and it's quite humorous. I looked it up, and so let me just see if we can find that discussion. First one, it comes early on when M, the recorder of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, has come to Sri Ramakrishna, and Sri Ramakrishna points out, M asks him, can one realize God while performing one's duties? Can Rama and desire, Rama and Kama coexist? The other day I read in a Hindi couplet, where Rama is, there Kama cannot be. Where Kama is, there Rama cannot be. So M was constantly struggling with this idea of being a householder versus being a monk. Part of him wanted to give up everything and be a monk. And Sri Ramakrishna dissuaded him from that. He knew that he had a different role in life. So he's asking, can we realize God while engaged in our duties in the world? And Sri Ramakrishna answers, all without exception perform work. Even to chant the name and glories of God is work, as is the meditation of the non-dualist on I am He. So everything we do, even spiritual practice, is work. Breathing is also an activity. There is no way of renouncing work altogether. So do your work, but surrender the result to God. So Sri Ramakrishna is giving him the basic teaching of karma yoga, right, early on. And then M asks him, sir, may I make an effort to earn more money? And Sri Ramakrishna says, it is permissible to do so to maintain a religious family. You may try to increase your income, but in an honest way. The goal of life is not the earning of money, but the service of God. Money is not harmful if it is devoted to the service of God. So there he gives that clear teaching. But later on, his disciple Adhar was a deputy magistrate, which earned a very high salary of 300 rupees a month. And I don't know what that means in today's numbers, because this was in 1883 or 84, something like that. And this was a monthly salary. It was a big salary. A deputy magistrate is some kind of judicial officer who earned a big salary. And he was trying to get a better post. He was trying to get a post. This post was a government post that carried with it great prestige, but he wanted to get the job of vice chairman of the Calcutta municipality, which was 1,000 rupees a month, really a big sum of money in those days. And so Adhar had interviewed many people and lobbied hard to get the job, but he didn't get it. Though apparently Jadu Malik said that he could try for the job again later. He never got the chance. He died young. He died within a year. So Sri Ramakrishna was not pleased with Adhar. He said, "Why did you dance attendance on all those small-minded people? You have seen so much. You have heard so much." And Adhar is arguing with him. He says, "A man cannot but do these things if he wants to lead a householder's life. You haven't forbidden us to, have you?" So then he scolds Adhar. He tells him, "Be satisfied with the job you have. People hanker after a post paying 50 or 100 rupees, and you are earning 300 rupees. You are a deputy magistrate. I saw a deputy magistrate at Kamarpukur. His name was Ishwar Ghoshal. He had a turban on his head. Men's very bones trembled before him. I remember having seen him during my boyhood. Is a deputy magistrate a person to be trifled with? Serve him whom you are already serving. The mind becomes soiled by serving but one master, and to serve 5 masters." So he's suggesting that at a certain point we have to understand, all right, this is enough. How much harder am I going to work? How much more am I going to seek for wealth? All right, it's my duty to earn wealth, to support my family and to support society. But how much am I going to do? If I get a job for 1,000 rupees, that's going to be more. I'll be working longer hours. It'll be more trouble, actually. So is it worth the trouble? And then Adhar continues to argue with Sri Ramakrishna. Narendra was there, was of course Sri Ramakrishna's beloved disciple, and was in very difficult financial circumstances because his father had died, leaving the family there was no health and life insurance or anything like that, no funds. They were starving, literally starving. And Adhar asked Sri Ramakrishna, "May I ask if Narendra would accept a job?" Sri Ramakrishna, "Yes, he would. He has his mother, brothers, and sisters to support." Adhar, "Well, Narendra can support his family with 50 or with 100 rupees. Will he try for 100? So he's still arguing with Sri Ramakrishna. Sri Ramakrishna doesn't answer directly. He says only, "Worldly people think highly of their wealth. They feel that there is nothing like it." Shambhu said, "It is my desire to leave all my property at the lotus feet of God." But does God care for money? He wants from his devotees knowledge, devotion, discernment, and renunciation. So this is the little argument that Sri Ramakrishna had, Adhar had with Sri Ramakrishna. Adhar wanted the big post with the big money, and Sri Ramakrishna was dissuading him. So that's a little more grist for the mill, we can say. So we're coming back to Karma Yoga. Swamiji's reading from the Mahanirvana Tantra. Often people enter into things they have not the means to accomplish and the result is they cheat others to attain their ends. Then there is the time to be taken into consideration. What at one time might be a failure would perhaps at another be a very great success. This problem of cheating. Othar may have to start cheating and telling lies to get this kind of a job. A lot of times it's not worth the mental trouble to get involved in these things. And yet, at the same time, it may be our calling to be a fighter. It may be our calling to run for office and to be dedicated to serving others through political office and doing it honestly. It's hard to find an honest politician, but I'm sure there must be there. So it maybe that's our calling, to be an honest politician. The householder must speak truth and speak gently, using words which people like, which will do good to others. Neither must the householder brag of his or her own doings or talk of the business of other people. The householder, by making reservoirs for water, by planting trees by the roads, by making almshouses for people and animals, by making roads and building bridges, goes towards the same goal as the greatest yogi. These are the kind of charitable activities which were done in ancient India. The wealthy person would make a reservoir. Water is an essential part of life. Where do you get water? Well, from reservoirs. You have to dig it out and dig it nice and deep so it fills with water and holds water for the people. Building roads, planting trees by the roads so that people have shade to rest under during the heat of the midday when they're on a journey. All these kinds of charitable activities. Today in Los Angeles, we won't go building reservoirs. There's no rain, so what water will the reservoir hold? So maybe building reservoirs is not our, but it could be some kind of system of extracting, saving the dew, so collecting the dew in the early morning and collecting it in vessels. Coming up with such an invention, that would be a great charitable work. Along these lines. Water is essential, so here in Los Angeles also water is essential. Even planting trees, it can be a service. This is one part of the doctrine of Karma Yoga, activity, the duty of the householder. There's a line there later on in this same scripture where it says that if the householder dies in battle, fighting for his country or his religion, he comes to the same goal as the yogi by meditation, showing that what is duty for one is not duty for another. And at the same time, it does not say that this duty is lowering and the other elevating. Each duty has its own place. And according to the circumstances in which we are placed, so must we perform our duties. It's clear. Swamiji is repeating it again and again, and that's to drive it deeply into our hearts, that yes, it's also the way we can approach even little things. You know, we have in our monastery, we eat together 2 or 3 times a day, and after the meal, someone has to prepare that meal. So we ourselves have to prepare the meal, and we have to clean up afterwards. And I can assure you that the least favorite part of the meal is always cleaning up afterwards. People don't like to clean up afterwards. It's a mess, it's dirty, and we're always hoping that somebody else will do it. Actually, this is a great lesson in Karma Yoga. If we can take up this doing of dishes afterwards as a Karma Yoga, as yoga, how should we do it then? We should take it up perfectly. So we should, rather than quickly rinsing something and say, okay, it's clean enough, sometimes I find there are dishes which aren't clean yet. They've been washed and they've been put aside as clean, but they're not clean. Whoever was doing it a little hastily. They're trying to finish it quickly because they don't like doing dishes. And thereby they have not done it properly. So if we want to realize God, if we want to unfold our infinite potential, we have to give our whole mind to that. And when we are doing dishes, we have to give our whole mind to doing dishes. Or else, if we have a habit of not giving our whole mind to something because we don't like it, then how are we going to give our whole mind to God? We have to learn to give our whole mind to whatever we're doing. When we're doing dishes, give our whole mind to it. When we're meditating in the shrine, give our whole mind to God. If while doing dishes, we're only giving half our mind to doing dishes, and we think that we're going to be able to give our whole mind to God in the temple when we're meditating, forget it. We have to give our whole mind to the dishes when doing dishes, and our whole mind to God when meditating. That's how we turn doing dishes into yoga. And we have the perfect example of Brother Lawrence, which we discussed at our last class, how when he was in the kitchen, he would do everything for the love of God. If we're doing something for the love of God, naturally we'll try our best to do it perfectly. He wouldn't pick up a straw from the ground, but for the love of God. When he was flipping his omelette in the kitchen, he hated kitchen work. He admitted he hated it. But there he was put in the kitchen, and he turned it into yoga, and he attained tremendous joy from working in the kitchen, dedicating everything to the Lord. So this is our lesson. Actually, there's a somewhat along a similar line. This is in I believe it's the introduction to Thich Nhat Hanh's first book, Miracle of Mindfulness. He's a Buddhist. He's probably the second most famous Buddhist teacher in the world after the Dalai Lama. And he recently left his body. He wrote many books. This was his first book on meditation called The Miracle of Mindfulness. And it's also the very first book I ever read on meditation. It was in my mother's bookcase, and I found it there, and I read it. And in the introduction, one of his students describes how the teacher taught them how to do dishes. It was after the meal, dishes were to be done, and so one of the disciples said, well, I'll do the dishes. And Thich Nhat Hanh said, yes, but do you know how to do dishes? And the student thought, what is there about doing? Of course I know how to do dishes. How to do dishes? And Thich Nhat Hanh said, are you doing dishes to get it over with so that you can do the next thing? Or can you do the dishes just to do the dishes? It's a very Zen approach. Do the dishes just to do the dishes. Not do the dishes so quickly to get it over with so that I can come back and sit at the table with my teacher. Do the dishes just to do the dishes. In other words, do the dishes as an offering to God. It means basically the same thing. A different way of saying the same thing. Give your whole mind to what you're doing. Be fully present. The divine is present right here, right now. We are one with the divine. Can we feel that? Can we give our full attention to what we are doing? That attention itself, that is a manifestation of consciousness. When we're giving attention to something, we are bringing awareness to what we are doing. It's shining in consciousness. We are that consciousness. That consciousness is the divine. Can we do it with full consciousness? Then we're doing it with the awareness of the divine. Does that make sense? So this is a little thought on karma yoga in the kitchen. So Swami Vivekananda continues, one idea comes out of all of this, the condemnation of all weakness. This is a particular idea in all our teachings, which I like, either in philosophy or in religion or in work. If you read the Vedas, you will find this word always repeated, fearlessness. Fear nothing. Fear is a sign of weakness. This is one of Swamiji's great messages also. Be fearless. The coward dies 1,000 deaths. The hero dies once. Be fearless. Fear is a sign of weakness. A person must go about his or her duties without taking notice of sneers and the ridicule of the world. If one retires from the world to worship God, one must not think that those who live in the world and work for the good of the world are not worshiping God. Neither must those who live in the world for wife and husband and children think that those who give up the world are low vagabonds. Each is great in his or her own place. Okay, and then he closes this class with a somewhat long story, quite interesting story. And I think there's nothing to do but to read it. And so there's not necessarily that much commentary to be told about this story, but it's an amusing story to demonstrate this idea that each is great. We are great in our own place. Let us shine in our own place and not think that we are in the wrong place. We are in the right place if we know how to put our whole mind in it and manifest the glory of the divine through our speech, through our action, through our thought. A certain king used to inquire of all the sannyasis, all the monks that came to his country, which is the greater man, he who gives up the world and becomes a sannyasi, or he who lives in the world and performs his duties as a householder? Many wise men sought to solve the problem. Some asserted that the sannyasi was greater, upon which the king demanded that they prove their assertion. When they could not, he ordered them to marry and become householders. So this is a very bad king for monks. They were all turned into householders when they couldn't prove that sannyasis were better. So then some others came and said, the householder who performs his duties is the greater man. Of them too the king demanded proofs. When they could not give them, he made them also settle down as householders. So he's making everybody householders. He didn't like monks, apparently. By the way, the source of this story is unknown. I couldn't find any reference to it in the scriptures. Swamiji, it may have been a story told among the monks, or he could have thought of it himself. It's not quite sure. There are some other stories of kings and sannyasis, but this particular story is, I haven't seen the source of it. But it's a delightful story. He could have heard it from Sri Ramakrishna also. These stories were current, told. The oral traditions of India have so many beautiful stories. At last there came a young sannyasi, and the king inquired of him. He answered, "Each, O king, is equally great in his place." "Prove this to me," replied the king. "I will prove this to you," said the sannyasi, "but you must first come and live as I do for a few days, that I may be able to prove to you what I say." The king consented and followed the sannyasi out of his own territory and passed through many territories until they came to another kingdom. In the capital of that kingdom, a great ceremony was going on. The king and the sannyasi heard the noise of drums and music and criers. The people were assembled in the streets in gala array, and a great proclamation was being made. The king and the sannyasi stood there to see what was going on. The crier was saying that the princess, daughter of the king of that country, was going to choose a husband from among those assembled before her. It was an old custom in India for princesses to choose husbands in this way. It's called the swayamvaram, which means choosing for oneself. And it's interesting that we think of, the patriarchal traditions of all our historical societies. And yet, there are some notable exceptions like this, where a princess would choose her husband. Not that the parents would figure it out, or the husband would choose the wife. Here, the princess would choose her husband. And the idea was that she would have a garland, and she would, among all the princes present, she would put the garland over the head of the one whom she selected as her husband, and then they would live happily ever after. Supposedly. A question?
In that case, can the king marry other like princesses too, or king has to stick to one princess?
Now you're asking questions that I have no idea about. Can a king marry many princesses? I have no idea. I don't think so. All right. So each princess had certain ideas of the sort of man she wanted for a husband. Some would have the handsomest man, others would have only the most learned, others would have the richest, and so on. The princess in the most splendid array was carried on a throne, and the announcement was made by criers that the princess so-and-so was about to choose a husband. Then all the princes of the neighborhood put on their bravest attire and presented themselves before her. Sometimes they too had criers to enumerate their advantages and the reasons why they hoped the princess would choose them. The princess was carried around and looked at them and heard what they had to offer, and if she was not pleased, she said to her bearers, move on, and no more notice was taken of the rejected suitors. If, however, the princess was pleased with any one of them, she threw a garland upon him, and he became her husband. So the princess of the country to which the king and the sannyasi had come was having one of these ceremonies. She was the most beautiful princess in the world. This is like a fairy tale. She was the most beautiful princess in the world, and the husband of the princess would be ruler of the kingdom after her father's death. The idea of this princess was to marry the handsomest man, but she could not find the right one to please her. Several times these meetings had taken place, and yet the princess had not selected anyone. This meeting was the most splendid of all. More people than ever had come to it, and it was a most gorgeous scene. The princess came in on a throne, and the bearers carried her from place to place. She did not care for anyone at all. And all became disappointed that this meeting also was to be broken up without anyone being chosen. Just then came a young man, a sannyasi, another sannyasi, handsome as if the sun had come down to the earth, and he stood in one corner of the assembly seeing what was going on. The throne with the princess came near him, and as soon as she saw the beautiful sannyasi, she stopped and threw the garland over him. The young sannyasi seized the garland and threw it off, exclaiming, "What nonsense do you mean by that? I am a sannyasi. What is marriage to me?" The king of that country, thinking that perhaps this man is poor, so would not dare to marry the princess, said to him, "With my daughter goes half my kingdom now, and the whole kingdom after my death." And he put the garland again on the sannyasi. The young man threw it off once more, saying, "What nonsense is this? I do not want to marry," and walked quickly away from the assembly. So it's quite humorous, and we monks love this story. You know, this idea of renunciation, the idea of monasticism, of not wanting to marry. For most people are called to find a mate in life. For most people are meant to find a mate in life. And most people do. And sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't work out. But still, that's the path for most people. For a few people, we want to go it alone. We don't want a mate. And it's maybe a common misconception that monks are miserable people because they have to practice celibacy and they have to practice poverty, and so it's a really hard and horrible life, and they're monks but they're wishing that they could be married or something. No, this story illustrates that the monk not interested. Just think, the most beautiful princess in the world wants to marry him, and the whole kingdom, half the kingdom comes to him immediately. So he has all the money he could want. And no, I don't want that. I want God alone. So that idea. So what happened? The princess had fallen so much in love with this young man that she said, "I must marry this man or I shall die." And she went after him to bring him back. Then the other sannyasi, our story, our each is great in his own place sannyasi, who had brought the king there, said, "King, let us follow this pair." So they walked after them, but a good distance behind. The young sannyasi who had refused to marry the princess walked out into the country for several miles, when he came to a forest and struck into it. And the princess followed him, and the other two followed them. Now the young sannyasi was well acquainted with that forest and knew all the intricate passages in it. And suddenly he jumped into one of these and disappeared, and the princess could not discover him. After trying for a long time to find him, she sat down under a tree and began to weep, for she did not know the way to get out of the forest again. Then the king and the other sannyasi came up to her and said, "Do not weep. We will show you the way out of this forest. But it is too dark for us to find it now. Here is a big tree. Let us rest under it. And in the morning we will go early and show you the road to get out." It's quite an involved story. A lot of little Sri Ramakrishna's stories usually were very short and to the point. But this is a really involved, long story. Now, so there they are in the forest. It's getting dark. There's the king and the sannyasi and the princess who didn't get her husband. Now, so they're going to spend the night in the forest. Now, a little bird and his wife and 3 little baby birds lived on that tree in a nest. This little bird looked down and saw the 3 people under the tree and said to his wife, "My dear, what shall be done? Here are some guests in the house, and it is winter, and we have no fire." So he flew away and got a bit of burning firewood in his beak and dropped it before the guests, and they added fuel to it and made a blazing fire. But the little bird was not satisfied. He said again to his wife, "My dear, what shall we do? There is nothing to give these people to eat, and they are hungry, and we are householders. It is our duty to feed anyone who comes to the house. I must do what I can. I will give them my body." So he plunged down into the midst of the fire and perished. The guests saw him falling and tried to save him, but he was too quick for them and dashed into the fire and was killed. The little bird's wife saw what her husband did, and she said, "Here are 3 persons and only 1 little bird for them to eat. It is not enough. It is my duty as a wife not to let my husband's effort be in vain. Let them have my body also." And she plunged down into the fire and was burned to death. Then the 3 baby birds, when they saw what was done, and that there was still not enough food for the 3 guests, said, "Our parents have done what they could, and still it is not enough. It is our duty to carry on the work of our parents. Let our bodies go too." And they all dashed down into the fire also. The 3 people could not eat these birds, and they were amazed at what they saw. Somehow or other they passed the night without food, and in the morning the king and the sannyasi showed the princess the way, and she went back to her father. Then the sannyasi said to the king, "King, you have seen that each is great in his own place. If you want to live in the world, live like those birds, ready at any moment to sacrifice yourself for others. If you want to renounce the world, be like that young man to whom the most beautiful woman and a kingdom were as nothing. If you want to be a householder, hold your life a sacrifice for the welfare of others. And if you choose the life of renunciation, do not even see beauty and money and power in anything. Each is great in his own place, but the duty of the one is not the duty of the other." So that's the story of that closes this class, this beautiful story of the king and the sannyasi. And the sannyasi managed to remain a sannyasi, this one also, because he was able to prove to the king that each is great in his own place. So it's a beautiful story. Any comments or questions?
How to separate calling from hobby
How to separate calling from hobby? That's a very interesting question. A calling from a hobby.
What is the question?
How to separate, how to distinguish between a calling and a hobby. A hobby. We have a calling and we have a hobby. Swami Vivekananda, interestingly, he said, it was in Ridgely Manor, and he learned, there was an artist there, Maud Stum, and he took painting lessons from her, and he did some drawings and paintings of which he was very proud, and he seemed to really love it. And someone made a comment about it, and he said, you see, we love those things with which we are not identified. Those things which we are fully identified with, it's not a question of love. We are fully identified with it. So as far as religion, I do not love religion. I am identified with it. But this painting is not something I know very well. I love it. Same with, and he mentioned Mrs. Sarah Bull, Mrs. Oli Bull, as she was called in those days, because they used the husband's name for the wife. Anyhow, Sarah Bull's husband, who had died, was Oli Bull, the great musician. And she said, your husband did not love music. He was identified with it. But he loved engineering, with which he was not so conversant as yet. So this idea of Swami Vivekananda himself had this, you could call this a hobby. He had a hobby of painting. But his calling was as a teacher, as a teacher of Vedanta, as a world mover, really, as a prophet. That was his calling. But Maud Stum, it seems that her calling was painting. True, really, for all of us, our true calling, however we may be doing it, our true calling is to know God, is to find God. Through whatever calling we have in the world, whatever our swadharma is, whatever our dharma is. So our true calling is to know God through this or that path. Is our calling to be a painter? Then we find God through art, through painting. What is our dharma to be an electrician? Then we find God through doing electricity. Is our calling to be an actor? Then we find God through acting. How do we do it? But true, for monks also, Swami Swahanandaji used to say, and who was he quoting? That it's good for monks to also have a hobby, to lessen the strain of life. Sometimes life can get stressful, and a hobby is something just to relieve the stress. If work gets really monotonous, a little hobby to relieve the stress. There's no harm in it. But it doesn't mean we should have 10 hobbies. Then where's life? Hobby means something on the side that's a little bit interesting. I remember when I was at Trabuco, that became a hobby for me. When I first joined the monastery, there was a lot of work, but there was also the fish pond. And it was sort of my duty to look after the fish pond, but it became a kind of hobby. I did the research, and I changed the filter to make the water clear, and I would go down, when I would go for grocery shopping, I would make a quick stop at the garden store where they had a section for water plants that were for ponds, and so I would look at those and I'd buy a small one, a small cheap one, and put it in and see that it would start growing. And so that was a kind of a hobby. But it wasn't separate from my life there. It was part of my life. So a hobby that's, we may be called to be a human rights lawyer, but we also love to cook. Swamiji loved to cook. You could say that was another hobby of his. He would love to cook for others. And he would come back to where he was staying and would say, let's cook. And then he would use all the vessels in the kitchen and make a huge mess and put lots of spices in it. And that was a great joy for him. That was like a hobby. It's a nice question. But really, what we want is a unified life. Not that we have different compartments in our life, and so now I'm a lawyer or a doctor or a plumber or whatever I'm doing, and now I'm a mother or a father or a spouse, And now I'm a cook while I'm cooking. We want a unified life. And what brings unity to the life is the spiritual side. When we find that everything, if we are really dedicated to spiritual life, if we're dedicated to finding the divine, to realizing God, then that unifies our life. That serves as a force which pulls everything into it. So when we're cooking, that's also an expression of our yearning for God. When we're raising our children, when we're teaching our kids, or when we're treating the patient, or fixing that leaky pipe, leaky faucet, everything is brought in to our. The whole life becomes yoga. That's the idea, that the whole life becomes yoga. Really, that's what karma yoga is. Ultimately, it's the art of making our whole life yoga. Not just when we go for meditation, not just when we go for prayer, not just when we go for our asanas. Whole life, it becomes yoga. That's the art of karma yoga, to make our whole life yoga.
Calling is something without which you cannot live. But these kind of pastime, this hobby, you can change. Today you are happy, tomorrow you are not happy, but calling is something, it is divine.
A hobby is something you can change.
Something
Yes.
that it is not fully dependent, you are not.
You can live without it.
You can adjust, but calling is something.
Calling is something deep, deep calling to it.
It is from divine, and
Yes.
it is from my own
Yes.
physical level. One is spiritual origin,
Yes.
other is physical level.
Yeah. Very good. Thank you. Any questions online? Well, there's a comment that kings mostly marry more than one. So Rama only married once, and hence famous as Ek Patni, Ek Bani, the one who had one wife and one who needed one arrow, Ek Bani.
In those days, kings used to marry if they wanted.
So it's a joy to share this study with you. Thank you for coming. It makes it possible to read it and think about it and share it. And shall we take just a moment of silence, and then we'll close with our prayer. Om Asato Ma Sanagamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Mritangamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. From the unreal, lead us to the real. From darkness, lead us unto light. From death, lead us to immortality. Om, peace, peace.